Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another head-to-head where I discuss favorite recordings of a famous Beethoven symphony with a special guest. And tonight we're discussing Beethoven's Seventh Symphony with special guest Janna Sailor. Janna, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks, Eric.
Good. Welcome here. Now, Janna, you're going to be a special guest conductor with us next season, but you've conducted the SSO before, haven't you?
I have. I mean, it's my hometown orchestra, and yeah, I made my debut. I believe it was in 2017 with SSO, conducting the pops show with Jeans and Classics,
Mm-hmm.
and it was fantastic to come home and work with my friends and colleagues, my former teachers. That was really an unforgettable experience for me to come back and conduct my hometown heroes, those that
Yeah.
I've been performing, since my earliest memories of seeing an orchestra perform. So I remember standing on the podium feeling like this was, a little bit otherworldly, or it was an interesting time when music and life collide, and
Exactly.
it's magic. Yeah.
Yeah, it must have been really special because you know all those people. You grew up with them, like you said. I'm sure some of them were your teachers, or at some point. Now you studied violin, didn't you? Your instrument, your main instrument, is violin.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I studied with Lillian Paisant,
Yeah.
a familiar face to the audience and orchestra members alike, and then and also Philip Kashup, and then Karen Bindle, and all of those teachers that worked in the Suzuki program. So they all raised me and nurtured me, and I felt so fortunate to have that experience. And actually, what I was thinking about the other day is when I was just collecting some things for this. It was Lillian Paisant that gave me a recording of Beethoven Lives Upstairs for
Oh.
as a gift when I was a little tiny violin player. I must have been 5 or 6, and that was my first kind of encounter with this particular symphony, Beethoven 7. Is the
Oh.
slow movement
Okay.
is featured on there very prominently,
Hmm.
and it was one of those interesting moments when I kind of realized that the power of music, and I have that very clear recollection of encountering that piece of music within that context, and just listening to that tape until I wore it out. But
Hmm.
the classical kids, such beautiful recordings and curated stories that were just such
Right.
a wonderful introduction to the repertoire. And yeah.
Wonderful. What a great way to be introduced to it. And what do you remember the exact feelings of that first or second listen? Yeah, tell me what you were feeling.
It was this profound sadness. I was like, I don't understand what this is, but this is this is what sadness feels like. This is what death feels like.
Mm, wow.
Music can make me feel sad even when I'm not sad, and likewise it can make me happy when I'm not happy. And I think that was something that I came to understand pretty early in life, as because of those recordings, when you expose these little ones to
Hmm.
this really powerful music that we maybe don't know to the extent that they can understand, but music like Beethoven is so universal that
Right.
there's always something that I think just anyone can grab onto and relate to. It just has that amazing, very humanist element to it that kind of defies description.
Well,
And if I can feel that as a 5-year-old,
well, and that's
how much.
that's just it. To have those feelings as a 5 year old and have the impact of someone like Beethoven, that's pretty powerful. And to be able to feel those feelings, or even, I guess, get to know that lesson where art or music can make such an impact on someone even 5 years old or even younger. That's pretty extraordinary. That's I'm glad you had that experience. Yeah.
And he's this composer that I've kind of walked along with throughout my career, and I mean this symphony in particular is some one of the pieces that made me really want to be a conductor. I feel like it's such a physical such a physical piece. I feel like it would make anybody, a conductor or not, wave their arms like a crazy person in their living room.
That's right. What in comparison to the other symphonies, what, and of course Beethoven wrote a lot of good ones. What really grabs you about Seven? What's special to you about Seven?
I think for me, it's one of those desert island pieces because it takes you through such a range of emotions, from this opening that is just transports you. You have these lush, beautiful chords just providing these pillars, and then there's like this seamless weaving of the first the oboe and then the clarinet, and it just starts to weave the orchestra together, just and it's just gives me a feeling of just expansiveness, and then we go into this 6/8 that he uses 6/8 so well. It's kind of like a rocking. It's elegant, but it has that kind of almost. The word that's coming to mind is a lullaby, but that's not quite right. It's lilting.
Right. It's lilting. It's a dance in a way. It's a dance in a way with the double dotted. It's that wonderful thing that kind of kicks it off, and that slow introduction. That's about a third of the whole first movement, and then kicks off this dance that really continues, even in the allegretto, even the slow movement, all the way right to the end, to the end of the fourth movement. Beethoven, we don't think of him necessarily as a dance composer, like let's say a Bach or Handel with all the, of course, Baroque movements, but there's such rhythm in his music.
Yes, and quoting fashioning the third movement after kind of a contradance of sorts. It always makes me want to get up in the morning and do all the things. And also when you think of the context in which he wrote it, I mean, Napoleon was stomping all over his country, and he was in, horrendous physical health. He had unbelievable personal problems and financial problems, and he can still write something like that.
Exactly.
To me, that was just like, it's such a gift. Mm-hmm. It's like, what is my excuse? To me, I haven't read anything to this effect at all, but to me, it was like his gift to the people of Vienna, who just been besieged for months and years at a time, and it was something that kind of encapsulated everything that life was, and that, but also that what it could be, on the other side, because we have the funeral march that's, there was certainly a lot of death and struggle, and but then there's also just this unbridled joy.
Exactly.
And I think that's what gets me every time, and kind of gets a catch in my throat, but in a good way.
So much of Beethoven's music does that. It's almost overwhelming in its emotional impact, even though a lot of that impact is rhythmic, is harmony, but when it might not be a melody like a Mahler or one of a later romantic, but there's something very, very visceral, and you use the word human before, and that's especially. You talked about the social surroundings, but then his own personal thing, issues. Let's call them issues. But being basically deaf and bringing that joy out throughout it all. And so let's get into the nuts and bolts of it. And let me just before we see if we've got some lovely people listening. Hello, Janna from Karen Lilly. Lovely to see you, and so many other people. And Doig, Megan is here, Kay Turner. But let's get to the face-off. Good. So your first, I added that little bell there. That first recording that you'd like to say is who's recording and from when?
Yeah. So I'm a sucker for those old recordings. I love to look back to those, the the golden age of the orchestras, and some of these really wonderful masters on the podium. So for today, for my first selection, I chose Toscanini and the New York Phil from 1936. And if you can, listen past, the graininess of it, this pure Toscanini comes through, and that attention to detail, his amazing ears, his attention to balance and the timbre of the orchestra. So that really comes through, especially in the first movement, I feel.
Mm-hmm.
And that this is my all-time favorite opening of Beethoven 7. I feel like he really uses those opening pillars, those opening chords, and just in a way that is warm, and it punctuates the line without interrupting it, which I think is incredibly difficult to achieve and to communicate to your players. And the other thing that really comes across to me in this particular recording, so this was at the end of his tenure with the New York Phil, and it was obvious that they had a synergy, kind of an organic relationship between ensemble and the maestro. We're going back to a time where there was very little as far as editing possible. This was before auto-tune and flex time and all of that, and just how the accuracy of the first movement is quite astounding. And so I think that only comes with really enrolling the ensemble and having them listen just as acutely as you are listening on the podium. And to me, that's what comes through in this recording. And so maybe there'll definitely other things as well.
Well, and for those of you who don't know, but Arturo Toscanini was one of the greats of the 20th century. He was also a tyrant, and so you mentioned the synergy. By all means, there was synergy there, but also probably a lot of fear, because this was before unions. Unions started coming in about 50s or so, and so a conductor actually had the ability to fire players on the spot and tell them to leave. And so with Toscanini's recordings, and there's very famous recordings of him yelling and screaming in Italian and English about how boneheaded people are, etc. The basses can't ever play right, etc., etc. But these recordings, like you mentioned, so this is in 36 with New York, and then he did a whole nother set of Beethoven symphonies in 39, starting in 39 with the NBC Orchestra. So Toscanini had the choice of NBC, the radio. Well, it was radio at the time, not television yet. Put together an orchestra just for him, and some of the best players in America came and played for this orchestra. And so those recordings, you mentioned there's a tightness to them. Toscanini was different than a lot of recordings at the time, or a lot of conductors at the time, where he was adamant that everything had to line up and everything had to be such a way. And so when last week with Martin, I talked about historically informed performance, and for all of you listening, I told you about the metronome markings and how some of them back in the day, in what we call old school, didn't necessarily follow those tempi, but Toscanini actually did. When you listen back, I remember I listened to him once and I thought, I'm not gonna like Toscanini at all, but his tempo markings were right there. Everything is exact, and I think you're right. This comes through in this recording.
And also with his the second movement, Allegretto. Allegretto, I find to be one of the trickiest tempo markings to nail. There wasn't. It's just not fast. It's not slow. It's not fast. It's right in the middle. And this movement can really suffer if it's too slow or if it's too fast. And I feel like he has that gift of finding that in between in between tempo that just sits, but not just sits. You can get the tempo marking as far as like the metronomic value, but as far as having it flow,
that's right.
In an allegretto kind of fashion. We could nerd out about tempo
exactly.
markings.
I know, Janet, we could go on and on. But let's go to your second recording that you chose.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is kind of on the other side of of the coin. This is going from old school to quite recent, and this is the Simon Bolivar Youth Orchestra and Gustavo Dudamel from 2016. And I don't know about you, but when I first encountered the Sistema orchestras, and in particular Simon Bolivar, it changed the way I listened to music. It changed the way I saw music. And when I would watch them perform, I was just like, it was electrifying. And just the passion and the commitment that they bring to it. And it almost didn't matter if I didn't care for the interpretation, because I was so convinced of their delivery of it, that I'm a fangirl of everything they put out because of the intention behind it, and the reminding me of the potential power of my profession, the potential power of music, what it can do for people. We talked earlier about how impactful Beethoven was upon me as a tiny child, but these are people that are living this, and literally lives have been saved because of Beethoven and because of this program and this system. And so I always find this their work profoundly moving and exciting, and gives me so much hope for classical music, for the next generations, for the continuation of classical music, like all those things that we talk about in meetings that are terrifying. And I find it so refreshing, and as I said, it almost doesn't matter what the interpretation is.
That's a great point. The Simon Bolivar Orchestra is out of El Sistema. It's a system that is in Venezuela, and it gives any kid, especially a lot of poor kids, a chance to play orchestral music. And Gustavo Dudamel is probably their most famous graduate, I guess you would say. He was a violinist, then started early as a conductor, and now he's the conductor of the LA Phil. But like you said, the energy. So we talk about youth orchestras, and they often have energy, and we think, oh man, it's a lot of fun to do a rehearsal with a youth orchestra because they're not jaded and they're ready to go. Well, the Simon Bolivar Orchestra is exceptional, not only in its energy, but its playing and its technique. And there's something very, very special about bringing Dudamel and them together. And I really appreciate, because this is going to be one of our first, not disagreements, but I'm not necessarily a fan of Dudamel's this repertoire, Beethoven, Haydn, Mozart, that. Yes. But like you say, the energy of it is undeniable, and there's something beautiful about that, where everyone is going absolutely nuts. Take a look on YouTube of this orchestra, and you'll see what we mean. There's an excitement and an energy that goes beyond so much of what we normally know or see.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Good. So let's now we're switching in and out. This is great. I love it. What's your third choice?
Okay. So my third choice is Orenstein conducting the Boston Symphony, and this is his final performance ever. And this was in Tanglewood in 1990. And it's a live performance. I mean, there's so many videos and recordings of Bernstein doing Beethoven with all the orchestras, but this one I found especially interesting and moving. Once again, it's a live performance, and I don't necessarily agree with everything interpretively, but I found it profoundly moving because this is Bernstein at the very end of his life. I think he died like a week later or something after, and having lived his entire career with Beethoven, and there's some really beautiful subtle moments, and just his very human way of communicating to the orchestra. For me, that humanity that touches me in Beethoven really comes through in this performance with Bernstein, and it's as if he knew, like perhaps that this was nearing the end, not just of his career, because he was retiring after this concert, but of his life. And the second movement especially is, I find, interesting. You know, there's variations in tempo, but you know, I don't notice, I don't mind it in this context. Mm-hmm. And there's coughs and, you know, things to remind you that there are people there that are taking this in. And I just find that to be a really interesting kind of mark in musical history, and you know, the end of an era of Bernstein.
And it's very fitting that it was his last concert, and how at the time, right before he died, and especially a couple of years before he died, he was not in great health. And he also, not just physically, but mentally, there are a lot of issues. And he lived his life in a way that was complex. Let's just say that. And so Lenny was, and everyone called him Lenny. Everyone called him Lenny. He was often a very emotional person. Not often, almost always an extremely emotional person. And then sometimes during his career, that got the better of him, I think, in a lot of the recordings. I do love Bernstein in a lot of things. But look at us. I did this with Martin last week. I'm trying to disagree, but I'm agreeing with you. And I remember when he died, it was about a month later, I was at university, and we're on our way to perform our first orchestral concert of the year, and our conductor told us that Bernstein had died. But it was he even those coughs that you hear on the recording, some of those are his. He had a hard time even getting on stage for this. And so knowing that, but also knowing where he came from in terms of where he was in his life, that recording, sure, the Allegretto is in other years you might say he was schmaltzy, but in this context, it's just Lenny, and it's a beautiful, almost a tribute to himself. So I agree. I would not necessarily choose Lenny as a favorite of mine, but I told Martin last week that I did have my first recording of Beethoven was, I think it was grade 4 or so. My parents bought me a cassette of Beethoven 5 and 7 with Lenny in Vienna, and I played that forever. So that's probably somewhere in my mind, that recording. Nice. And now you've done your 3, and actually we were discussing a little bit before. I'm going to bring mine up.
Great.
And it's Nicholas Harnoncourt, who died just only a couple of years ago. Yes. And Harnoncourt was a cellist originally in Vienna, in the Vienna Phil. And then he started researching early music, or music that was from the Baroque era and the Renaissance even, and classical era like Mozart and Haydn, and started saying, hold on, there's ways that we're not playing it how they used to play it. And so Harnoncourt was a person who was kind of the grandfather of the historically informed performance practice that I mentioned last week. And but he was never dogmatic. And Harnoncourt, with this recording with the Chamber Orchestra of Europe, which is one of my favorite groups, no matter who is in front of them, the Chamber Orchestra of Europe is an orchestra that combines some of the best players in the biggest European orchestra, the Berlin Phil, the Concertgebouw in Amsterdam, Orchestre de Paris, all these orchestras, the Bavarian Radio Orchestra, all these soloists basically come together for the Chamber Orchestra of Europe. And this recording, he did these series, or this all 9 of them plus other Beethoven works. And there is of course, early music historically informed practice, but it's not dogmatic. And there's a beautiful sensibility to it. It's not too fast, it's not too slow. And I don't love all the symphonies that he recorded, but I will almost always like at least 2 of the movements of every one. And Beethoven 7, I just absolutely adore his recording of this. Do you know this recording?
I'll have to reach back. I know I've visited. I'm a Harnoncourt fan, so I'm sure I've listened to it along the way. But I'll have to. Now I'm inspired to go back and re-listen. I'll go dive down that rabbit hole.
That's right. And this is he from friends who are in the Chamber Orchestra Europe and others who have worked with them say he would often. He wouldn't lecture. He would just discuss his ideas in front of the orchestra all the time. And he would say this or that. He's like, ooh, and he would change it here and there. And so there was something that kind of organically came out of those rehearsals where, of course, he had a certain idea of how he wanted it to go, but there was actual music making all the time, not just this is how you do it, let's do it this way. And so that's very inspiring. As conductors, there's always a fine balance, and it's difficult sometimes. But I always admired Hardencourt for his humanity, and we're talking about humanity in Beethoven, so I think it's a good fit. Yeah.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And I want to ask you, do you know the Carlos Kleiber famous recordings from about mid-70s?
Yes. Yeah.
And Deutsche
Yeah.
Grammophon.
Yeah, Deutsche Grammophon. And for anyone else who wants to kind of join us on this journey, there's a kind of a compilation. I think it's put out by Deutsche Grammophon. It's like 10 conductors do Beethoven, and it's just like all these historical, to present day recordings of a whole bunch of the symphonies. I'm not sure if they've made it all the way through all 9. But those are fantastic if anybody wants to kind of do the same thing that we're doing on their own home. And it's fascinating.
It's really fascinating. And YouTube, thank goodness for YouTube, my goodness. You can find anything on YouTube. And I mean, Janna and I are, like you say, geeking out about this. We could go on forever discussing this stuff. But the YouTube is wonderful to see these conductors and how they are, because Bernstein is so different than Toscanini. And it's so different than Dudamel. And if you want to see elegance versus not the most elegant, Harnoncourt was definitely not the most beautiful conductor. He kind of just went like this, or Otto Klemperer, for instance. But elegance to the extreme is Carlos Kleiber, and the way he does it. And there's a beautiful live recording of him performing Beethoven 4 and 7 live with the Concertgebouw Orchestra. And at the end of Carlos Kleiber's life, he didn't conduct hardly at all, and he had a couple of favorite orchestras, the Concertgebouw and the Bavarian Radio Orchestra in Munich. And he would only conduct 1 or 2 concerts a year, and then often he would cancel those. And so he was very, very sought after. But luckily, we have a few recordings, also with the Vienna Phil, some Mozart and some Brahms. But it's fascinating to see him and other conductors do their stuff.
Mm-hmm. And it's fascinating for me personally to see, an orchestra like Vienna Phil play these things over and over, but with different conductors, and to see the influence. That's fascinating to me. There's some conductors they stand up on the podium and they totally change the sound of the ensemble or the attack, or it just
completely. That's a great point. And this is why it's so fast. This is why classical musicians play these pieces over and over, because they're, of course, not a museum, but they're a new piece every single time, because we actually have to make them live off the page. Yes. And you're right, Vienna Phil, one of the most established orchestras in the world. They can sound so different from week to week. And I have a great example of this. I lived in Amsterdam for a year, about 10 or 15 years ago. And one week, I went to a concert that had Harnoncourt conducting, and it wasn't a Beethoven symphony, but it was a Mozart 40th, the G minor, and he conducted it, and the whole orchestra played in an early music approach. And this is a modern orchestra, but a lot of orchestras are so nimble they can do this, and they loved Harnoncourt, and so they did it. Then about 4 weeks later, one of their principal conductors, Bernard Haitink, who is Dutch and had conducted the Concertgebouw since the 50s after the war. It was such a different interpretation, very what we would call old school, not very early historically informed, but the orchestra was so into it. And those two examples were just beautiful. It didn't matter. I lean towards early music or historically informed, but my God, did I love the Haitink as well. And it's a wonderful example of those contrasts, or a wonderful thing to see. Yeah.
Yeah, brilliant and fascinating.
It is. Yeah. Anyone out there have questions? I think everyone's been listening very nicely. But anyone have questions for Saskatoon's own Janna Sailor? I'm sure let's see if there's one from before. But Janna, tell us a bit about you have your orchestra Allegri, and just tell us about that.
Absolutely. So I founded Allegra in 2016. It's an all-female orchestra with a social action mandate. So our motto is "Women helping women through music." So everything that we put out, all our events, all of our concerts, have a social action focus, whether that be bringing certain things to our attention of the general public through music, or usually most of our concerts have a portion of our proceeds going towards a social cause. One of our major projects was the founding of a music therapy program at a women's shelter on the downtown east side of Vancouver. If you're not familiar with kind of the social uh, paradox that we have in Vancouver, there's this huge gap between rich and poor, and homelessness is an extreme challenge for the city in general. And because of the mild climate, I think there's a lot of homelessness there that maybe you wouldn't see in the rest of Canada.
Right.
So that's something that I was really drawn to do. I'd come out from a concert hall after having performed, and there'd be homeless people just outside the stage door, and it really made me start to think, like, how is it that I get to be in there and they're out here, and what really separates us? And so that was a lot of the motivation behind starting Allegra, was to have that social action mandate that I could bring about and support change through my art form, while also supporting the work of female and minority artists in our musical output. So the majority of our programming is female and minority artists, and we've commissioned over 10 works from female and minority artists over the past 4 years.
Wow.
And we have a really interesting project coming up next season called Her Projected, which is all concertos written for kind of unusual instruments and instrument combinations that we will be performing, written by Canadian and female composers. Alice Ping Ho is one of them. Our composer in residence, Elizabeth Knutson, is another one, and Japanese Canadian composer Rita Ueda. All three of those composers are writing us original works for solo instrument and chamber orchestra. So we're really excited to be bringing that to the mainstream and the concert stage.
Fantastic, Janet. That sounds like an amazing project. Bravo to you to get that off the ground and to be successful. That's fantastic. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you.
Yeah.
It brings me a lot of joy, and I hope it brings the same to others.
I'm sure it does. Yeah, we're it's funny because I asked for some questions. Now we have a couple of questions that we'll just wrap up very quickly the next couple of minutes. But Ann Doig says, top 3 works you would have or you have or would have or would like to conduct. Your top 3 works.
Ooh, that is so only 3.
I
know. Let's see. Okay, Mahler 2. Huge forces. That I have dreams of bringing professional orchestra, youth orchestra, and like basically anybody else I can find to do Mahler 2. Also, Messiah is coming up for me. My first Messiah. All from top to bottom.
Fantastic.
So that's something that I'm looking forward to. Of course, you touched on it all the way through your studies, and you do excerpts, but I haven't done the whole thing just yet. So I'm really excited to do that with Symphony New Brunswick next season.
Fantastic.
And I love premieres. Every time I get to do a premiere, it's just that gets my my adrenaline going, being able to see a piece of music come to life and work, hand in hand with the composer. Like any premiere that's is being created, it's really exciting for me, especially when you see Canadian and minority artists start to take take flight and take the stages. That's what they bring, so many new things and bring new elements to it, and that's, to me, that's what music making is all about, is collaborating and discovering and recreating and seeing what comes from that.
Exactly. Yeah. And we have such a treasure nowadays with Canadian music, and like you said, minority composers and premieres are so special. And just to bring it to life so that it, because we study the score, and then the orchestra gets to know it, and then the audience gets to know it. And there's something very, very exciting about that. And I love that your first Messiah is coming up. Oh, you're gonna love it. And Mahler too. Who doesn't love Mahler too? Well, Janna, this has been a treat. Such a lot of fun with you, and I'm glad we could get into there. I'm going to do this one last time. And so, thanks so much. And for all of you out there, Thursday we're back with another Meet the Musicians in Your Neighborhood with Dean McNeil, trumpet player. But in the meantime, stay healthy, stay warm. It's not even cold outside, but stay warm in Calgary there, Janna. And thanks so much for joining us. And hopefully we'll see you live soon.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you so much, Eric. Thanks everyone for watching.
You bet. Good night, everyone.
Take care.